So the challenge for religious leaders is not just how to work together with other religious groups with whom, there may be past and current enmities, distrust, that certainly can happen, but also how to reconcile the idea of pluralism, practical social pluralism, with their theological traditions, which emphasize unity and monism.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore how religion is lived. I'm your host, Elaine Howard Eklund. I'm a sociologist and director of the Boniuk Institute at Rice University. Today we're going to be talking about multiculturalism, secularism, and the role of public religion. Our guest is Tariq Modood, a professor of sociology, politics, and public policy. Tariq is also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at the University of Bristol in the UK. In addition to his academic career, he is highly committed to public engagement. He has served as an advisor to the Muslim Council of Britain, the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, the National Equality Panel, and the Commission on Religion and Belief in British Public Life. His latest book, which I have read and you will want to get it, and which we will be discussing today, is The New Governance of Religious Diversity with Thomas Seeley. I should also mention that Tariq is currently visiting Rice University's campus and the Boniuk Institute as the recipient of our Boniuk Institute 2025 Senior Scholar Award. Just to tell you a little bit more about it, the award is given annually to a senior scholar who has made an outstanding contribution to the public understanding of religious pluralism and tolerance. Tariq gave a lecture on the Rice campus last night about his work, and now I'm so pleased for him to be able to share this work and his ideas with the wider audience of Religion Unmuted. Thank you for joining us, Tariq.
My pleasure, Elaine.
So let's just jump right in. In these times, what role do you think religion is playing in modern multicultural societies?
Well, I think we have to first begin with demography. Just numbers, because as we all know, the demography of our societies, like the United States and Britain, has been changing over the last few decades, and of course is projected to carry on changing. And that means that new groups of people with specific identities are now part of a society that we'd call a multicultural society that weren't part of it before. So what kind of people, what kind of identities do people have? Or, given that we all have multiple identities, what in particular are ones that people are concerned to defend, defend against sometimes offense, and to project? And when people seek to be respected, what do they want to be respected as, assuming it's not just respected as individuals? Well, what's happened, I think, in some of our countries, is certainly true of Britain, is that we began with focusing on racial identities, like, black and Asian, or if you like, black and brown. But by the end of the 20th century, some of the people who previously were labeled by other identity categories like Asian, Pakistani, themselves started saying, we are Muslim. And as Muslims, we seek to be British and we seek various forms of inclusion and accommodation, not just assimilation. And some of this was to do with issues around, say, mosques and halal food, for instance, halal dress, including, the headscarf and so on. But more fundamentally, I think there was an identity issue as well. People were concerned to be recognized in terms that were meaningful to them, rather than categories that had been politically constructed, sometimes by racist legacies and sometimes by anti-racist challenges to those legacies, but which were still, as it were, over the heads of the lived identities. And so that's one of the ways that religious identities became publicly salient and politically prominent in Britain, and I think our neighbouring countries in Western Europe, because minorities, Muslims, because they're the single biggest religious minority in Western Europe, but also Hindus, and interestingly enough, I think Jews, who obviously have been in Europe for many centuries, began to assert a religious identity which overlapped with what we might call an ethnic identity, which can be best to be illustrated, in fact, by the Jewish experience, where Jewish people feel a sense of peoplehood, regardless of what they believe or do not believe. And I think that's actually currently being generalized to other minorities, Hindus, Muslims, and perhaps even to the Christian majority or elements of the Christian majority. So respect my religious identity, if you want to respect me and treat me with equality, has become a kind of implicit slogan in societies like Britain that seek to be publicly multiculturalist.
I want to ask you how you think these kinds of dynamics are different explicitly in the UK when compared to the US. You're living in the UK, but I know you've had significant experience in the US as well. So specifically, how do you think the ideas of multiculturalism and religious diversity are perceived differently in the UK and in the US, the kinds of dynamics that you think exist there?
Yeah, I think there are a number of differences, and without trying to be comprehensive, one very interesting one, which initially actually, I think, was drawn to my attention by American sociologists who came over to Western Europe to study what was happening in Western Europe, and to some extent were a bit surprised because their preconceptions didn't fit our lived experience. So America, in the second half of the 20th century and perhaps earlier, has obviously had lots of migration from all over the world. And with migration comes issues about integration. And the American way became, in the second half of the 20th century, became that actually, if you integrate through your religious communities, you are being a good citizen. You are creating settled communities, stable families, perhaps with, weekend religious schooling or evening religious instruction. And you are interacting with your co-religionists, who often were also your co-ethnics. So you're keeping alive your religious traditions and so on without the state having to do very much. You're also doing business together and so on. So religion was seen as a way of integrating, and the migrants responded positively to that in ways, for instance, that they recognized that the national holy day was Sunday. And so religions like Judaism and Islam that have their religious prominent day, the Sabbath or the prayer, collective prayer, the Jummah prayer for Muslims, began to gravitate towards Sunday as the day of religious meetings, the day of religious community. So when these sociologists looked at Western Europe, they realized that there was a lot of talk about certain groups not integrating. Failure to integrate was the discourse. And who were these groups? Well, at the top of the list were Muslims. And why were they failing to integrate? Well, a couple of reasons were given, but one of them was because they're too religious. So Americans said, yeah, become like us by joining and supporting your religious community, your quasi-church-like formation. In Europe, we said, hey, don't scare us by becoming so religious. Hang loose, stay relaxed about your religion, and don't congregate together. So, yeah, that is quite, laughable and paradoxical, but that is a genuine sociological divergence. And is rooted, of course, in the ways that religion means different things in the two locations. In many ways, America is such a religious country, or certainly has been, whereas Western Europe has had its moments of religious intensity, of course, some of them leading to the creation of refugees who then colonized this continent. But on the whole, the idea of modernity in Europe is understood as something, as a movement away from taking your religion too seriously.
Mm-hmm. We know, of course, that religious identities intersect with other kinds of identities and social categories. So I might go to church and consider myself a Christian, but I am also a person who is Black. I'm a person who is a spouse. I'm a person, all of these other identities. So how do you think policymakers should navigate these kinds of complexities to ensure religious inclusion and tolerance?
Yeah, I would say there are two particular things that they should bear in mind, if you like, two principles. One is, yes, we all have multiple identities, but most people, especially disadvantaged people, who feel they need to assert an identity in order to be treated with equality and respect, tend to focus on one or a limited number of identities. So for a lot of people, of course, their gender is the identity they most focus on. For a lot of people, it's their occupation. And I think for multiculturalism, we should value the identities that people themselves value. The bearers of the identities should have, as it were, the last say, or the first say for that matter, on what should be the grounds of inclusion, as it were. What identity should be more profiled rather than less profiled. So that's the first principle. The second is, I think we have to find a way, and I don't say it's easy, and I don't say I've got the answer to it all, but we have to find a way of treating all, for the moment, just sticking to minority identities, all minority identities equally. And I don't think we do that in Britain, and I would be doubtful that you do that in the United States. I'll give you an example of what I mean. As we know, there is a certain amount of tension between some minorities or marginalized groups. One clear example is people who are religiously and socially conservative and people who espouse a sexual minority identity. And they're both mutually suspicious of each other, and they're forced to live together sometimes, under conditions of toleration. But they are sufficiently suspicious of each other to note how the other is being treated by the wider society. So in the last few decades, we've gone through a period where, for instance, institutions like universities, the BBC, cultural institutions in general, and even business corporations celebrate gay pride or celebrate, LGBTQ+. So socially, religiously conservative minorities, and perhaps also in the majority, but just focusing on minorities, they ask themselves, why do we have to celebrate that? No one is celebrating our identity. When will be the day in the calendar where we celebrate Muslim identity? Why some identities are celebrated and others are put up with? So I think that religious conservative people, and Muslims is the case in point, but not only, I think this is true in all religions to some extent, there's a sense that we are, as it were, second-class minorities. Some minorities are celebrated, some minorities are at best included and at worst put in a box somewhere in the corner.
So religious minorities face particular kinds of challenges often in multicultural societies, and they may want to be viewed a certain way, but the broader society may view them another way. And how can civil and religious leaders address these challenges? And I'm thinking in particular, preventing religious discrimination.
I think to some extent, religious minorities would approach this or can approach this in the way that any other minorities might. You know, you organize, you petition, you lobby, you get research done to publicize your circumstances and so on. So there's not a particular religious dimension in all that. The challenge for religious groups is that most of our religious traditions, and I'm thinking here particularly of the monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, are very ambivalent at best about pluralism. You know, one God, one law, one people. And yet, religious leaders, especially who might be more on the theologically liberal side of their traditions, they obviously imbue some of the ideas of current society, of contemporary societies, about valuing pluralism. And they sincerely hold those views, but also strategically they realize that it's better to ask for inclusion through pluralism rather than ask for inclusion through some kind of we are a chosen people, so respect us for that reason, rather than we're part of a plurality. And all the plurality should be respected. So the challenge for religious leaders is not just how to work together with other religious groups with whom, you know, there may be past and current enmities, distrust, that certainly can happen, but also how to reconcile the idea of pluralism, practical social pluralism, with their theological traditions, which emphasize unity and monism. And ideas which might be actually more strong in the conservative wings of their tradition than contemporary ideas about pluralism. So they've got quite a difficult navigation here. They want to be politically plural, but they are leading a community that might be theologically monistic.
So just getting a little bit more personal, I know our listeners would be interested to know, you know, about your own religious identity and how it's had an impact on the work you do as a sociologist and as a public intellectual.
So obviously, I was brought up in a Muslim family. I was brought up as a Muslim, and I think that has had a, you know, permanent influence, especially through my father, because quite unusually for a Muslim and an Asian Muslim in London, I was brought up